Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening, especially on a Monday night. It's good to see a great crowd, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this evening. So I'll start off with just some additional introduction. So this was already mentioned, but my commission is part of the DNCR, Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, which works to manage, promote, and enhance things that people love about North Carolina: diverse arts and culture, rich history, and spectacular natural areas. There are more than 100 DNCR sites across the state, and the department works to enhance education, stimulate economic development, improve public health, expand accessibility, and strengthen community resilience. And then we, with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, work with a mission to preserve, protect, and promote North Carolina African American history, art, and culture for all people. And we like to say that this shows up in three primary ways. So the first being working with our colleagues in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, making sure that they have the resources and the best practices they need for exhibits, programs, special events, various things that come up throughout the year. So we're grateful to work with our colleagues, but we also work to support folks across the state who are not attached to the department. It might be folks who might be in this very room who are stewarding a historic site or a historic cemetery, looking to start a small museum. We very much feel that we are stronger in doing this work together, and that our relationships are a very big piece of that. So we are grateful to be in relationship with folks across the state doing African American history, art, and culture. And so if you think of things or you have ideas or something that you'd like to check in with us about, please feel free. I do have my contact information available on the last slide, because we'd love to hear from you. And then last but not least, we have a number of our own initiatives, which I have represented on the slide here. African American Heritage Commission works from the various early days of African American history with our Africa to Carolina project, talking about disembarkation history in our state, on up through the present time. We have one focusing on Green Book sites, civil rights trail sites, freedom seeking, really a whole host of things, including, you'll see in the bottom right corner of the slide, a photo of North Carolina Freedom Park, which is the first park in North Carolina dedicated to the African American fight for freedom. And we are fortunate to steward that space and do the programming for it. I'll touch on it just a little bit as we get towards the end of my presentation, because it certainly ties in with what we're talking about today. All right, so I know I have several historians who are in here today, because you all have already pointed yourselves out to me, but not everyone necessarily knows a whole lot about this history that we're talking about. So I do like to just take a level setting moment to make sure we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about today. So just a few little key words and terms that I'll be using throughout my presentation to make sure that we're understanding what we're talking about here. So the first one being emancipation. It's one of those big words. We throw it around a lot with Juneteenth, but we're defining it as the fact or process of being set free from legal, social, or political restrictions, liberation. You'll also hear me use quite a bit the term enslaved persons. This is a really intentional language, particularly as a historian, that a lot of historians have moved to in the last 10, 15 years or so, in terms of trying to give personhood and agency to people in the past. Rather than calling them slaved, they are enslaved. They are people who are forced to perform labor or services against their will under threat of physical mistreatment, separation from family or loved ones, or death. The other term you'll hear me use quite a bit is freedom seekers. Again, an intentional choice, thinking about giving people agency during this time period. Rather than saying they were runaways, actually, they were seeking their freedom. This is an intentional choice, as they were enslaved people taking action to obtain freedom from slavery. And then the other thing that I want to note on this slide is talking about primary resources. It's been an interesting era to be doing history, particularly African American history, and I really want to emphasize this presentation in particular is full of what we call primary sources. So these are documents that were created at the time of the event, or from witnesses of the event. So we're going to see things like newspaper articles, letters, interviews from people about their experiences, and that's the foundation of this. All right, so we'll start off with the what is Juneteenth? How did we get this holiday? So very simply, it's our annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, and it is the oldest commemoration of its kind in the United States. It marks June 19th, 1865, when 2,000 Union soldiers arrived to the coastal island community of Galveston, Texas, with news that the war was over and that enslaved Texans were free. The other question that we get a lot is, especially this year with the 250th anniversary of the United States, is why are we celebrating both Juneteenth and 4th of July? What is the difference between these? And to answer that, I want to acknowledge a woman who we consider the grandmother of Juneteenth. Her name is Ms. Opal Lee, and she is someone who campaigned for decades for Juneteenth to become a federal holiday. And she describes it as the difference between the freedom for land versus the freedom for all people. Because the 4th of July is really marking the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, stating that we were free and separate from Britain, whereas that date, not everyone was free. So I think that that's just an important demarcation to know about as we're talking about it. And the other thing being that, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk more about, I already talked to someone on their way in, that was something that was issued in 1863. We're talking about Juneteenth in 1865. We're seeing a little bit of a difference in dates here. And that's really just the beginning of talking about this history is complicated. That's really kind of the theme of my presentation today. We love Emancipation Proclamation. We love saying, oh, everyone's free. Here's a very simple statement. But that's just not the truth of this history. It's really complex, and there are a lot of things that are occurring over time to get to where we are. So to start with the Emancipation Proclamation, this is from Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and the proclamation states, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will not act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for actual freedom. Again, a great statement, but that's not exactly how everything ended up playing out, because you have to remember this is during the Civil War. There is a whole chunk of the country that does not consider Abraham Lincoln to be their president. So why would they listen to his proclamation? The southern states are not seeing this, and so can really only be enforced in Union-occupied territories. And this includes part of North Carolina as the war progresses, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the other thing I want to point out is that there is intentional loopholes written into the Emancipation Proclamation. There is still slavery happening in the North in some counties, parishes, and cities, and the proclamation intentionally did not end this. There is some good news in the document. The proclamation announces the acceptance of black men into the Army, but again, it's a complex document. The other document that we'll dive into is General Order 3. So this is the document when we hear about the 2,000 Union troops arriving in Galveston, Texas. This is the document that they're issuing. This is the formal mechanism saying that people are free, and in fact, it was announced at many places in Galveston, including the church that I have pictured here, Reedy Chapel AME Church. And within this document, it states, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Again, a great and important announcement, but it's already having some stipulations to it. It's already showing that freedom and liberation were not instant with this document. It's asking for people to suddenly become employees and hired labor to the people that enslaved them. We're not talking about how much they're gonna get paid. We're not sorting out living situations or anything like that. And then they're also being told to stay quietly at their homes, to not gather and to not celebrate, which is really not a logical, practical, or reasonable thing to ask. And so there are Black people that defied parts of this order, and in some cases they did this at the expense of their own lives, and particularly as some former white slaveholders in Galveston would retaliate. So again, our understanding of Juneteenth, we're continuing to complicate it. I'm going to continue to complicate it further during our time together. But the other thing that I want to point out with what I've focused on here is Juneteenth, as you've heard, it's really a Texas story. We're talking about what's happening in Galveston, Texas. Of course, we're here in North Carolina. We're the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. So how do we talk about this here? And we see Juneteenth as an important opportunity to talk about what emancipation, what freedom seeking, what freedom looks like in our state, because it's, again, complicated. It's shifting over time, and it's really impacted by how the Civil War plays out. I will also talk a little bit towards the end of our time together about the history of Juneteenth celebrations in our state, because that is something that we also have a very long history of. So with that, for generations, enslaved people in North Carolina sought freedom in a diversity of ways over time. They did not have to wait for liberation to achieve it. It didn't happen on a single day from a single announcement. It was complicated and shaped by the Civil War and how it took place across our state. People sought their freedom. They served in the military, they established freedmen's colonies, and much, much more. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to honor formerly enslaved people who were able to achieve emancipation and claim their freedom. So Juneteenth is about celebrating liberation, the promise, the practice, and the reality of it. All right, so the first that we're going to talk about is public announcements of emancipation. What did that look like here in North Carolina? Just like in Galveston, we had some of that happening here too. And this is an excerpt that I have from a woman in Elizabeth City that has written in January 1863 to her husband. She states that a public announcement pronounced enslaved Black people in Elizabeth City free, and that Black men were promptly called to join the Army and ultimately to be armed. This coincides with the Emancipation Proclamation. Right when that is stated, there are people in North Carolina who do become free. So this is a series of letters that this woman wrote, including this excerpt, that were published in the Raleigh Standard towards the end of January 1863. All right, so for our next one that we'll take a look at, talking about word of mouth and observation and how another way that this news of emancipation was spread in North Carolina. So in our previous example, we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation being enforced in territories as the Union Army takes them. And that's not a clean process, and it shapes, it's very complex how this ends up being shaped. The other thing is that, during war, the infrastructure that was typical of this time period is not, it's broken. The country is in the midst of war. And so it's also not a time of social media. We're not like immediately seeing a post or anything like that. It's, you're not gonna call your friend. It's just not the reality of this time period. So people are still spreading this news word of mouth over time. And we do have documentation sharing this story. A lot of this specific documentation is coming from white people who enslaved others. But it is also telling and showing how Black people were navigating and responding to this news. So the image behind me is of a letter, and it was written in February 1862, and it's correspondence from a man in Windsor to his attorney. And what he's trying to do is to help his cousin decide what to do with the enslaved people considering the war on the coast. This is a really interesting example because it also shows instance of Black resistance at a very early time period. And what we see in this letter is that the people that are being enslaved are taking furniture from cabins and they're using it how they wish. They are breaking locks to buildings, taking valuables the owners have hidden and buried, and they've basically told their owner that if he attempts to move them, that they're not going. This particular point helps us to understand that these enslaved people were very much aware of the war and very much aware that this opportunity of emancipation was coming to them as the Union line shifts and that the word has been passed. And again, a documented instance of a resistance from, like, these are our ancestors. They were not just sitting and waiting for freedom to happen to them. The writer of this letter, in response to the resistance, aims to move the enslaved people, this is 100 people, 50 men and 50 women, dead or alive, inland, away from the war to the center of the state, or even out west, in order to force them to continue their labor. Unfortunately, this kind of behavior is not unique. It is something that we do see documented in several places in North Carolina, moving people away from the advancing war and therefore further away from freedom. And it's also definitely taking place after the Emancipation Proclamation has been announced. So this next one is talking about the press. We mentioned newspaper articles in the very early of this. So during the Civil War in North Carolina, there aren't very many newspapers in North Carolina, very few, and a lot of them, as you would expect, are Confederate leaning, and that's the kind of opinions and stories that they're sharing. But in some cases, we see local printing presses being overtaken by Union forces as they advance through North Carolina cities and town, and the word continues to be spread through newspaper. So there's several examples of this. The one that I have depicted here talks about, it's the title of it is Rules for the Government of Freedmen in North Carolina. This appears in June 13th, 1865 in the Western Democrat, which is a Charlotte newspaper. The war reached central and western North Carolina later than the coast and the east, as we've been talking about, but this notice was issued in Raleigh as early as May of 1865. So there's definitely a delay as we're seeing this as the Civil War moves. The date is also pretty close to Juneteenth, and it lists rules, including the first one that domestic rights, like parents having control of their children, now apply to those who were formerly enslaved. So they can parent their children now. We also have rule number 5, saying that freed people can find new homes wherever they find work, but will not be supported by the government nor by their former masters unless they work. It also details how these rules are to be enforced. So this is another instance from the press talking about the occupation of Wilmington. So in February 1865, Union occupation of Wilmington occurs, and the local printing press now runs a Union newspaper that includes, again, some instructions and some regulations. But we see from this particular account that a formerly enslaved man is helping to distribute these newspapers as far as Goldsboro and Salisbury. In this account from the Western Democrat from 1865, it says, "Since the occupation of the town of Wilmington by the Yankees, they have taken possession of the Carolinian printing office and now publish a paper called The Herald of the Union, copies of which have been received at Goldsboro and Salisbury through the hands of a Negro man who escaped from town. The paper contains many regulations for the government of the subjugated people of Wilmington." And I think that this is an interesting example because, again, Black people are liberating themselves, and then they're also helping to liberate others and to continue and to help spreading the news. And during this time period, you know, this gentleman distributing the newspapers, certainly risking his own safety to be distributing and sharing this news. Okay, so another pathway for freedom for folks would be through serving in the Navy. The Navy actually never barred Black men to serve. However, there were quotas that were enforced through the 1840s, and racism, discrimination were a very common experience for Black sailors. But nevertheless, it provided a path to freedom and also an opportunity for them to liberate themselves. So we see a number of instances of Black men, including enslaved, who would present themselves to U.S. Navy vessels. They could enlist, and then they could serve immediately. Our colleagues over at DNCR, the Historical Research Office, have found dozens of this happening just between 1861 and 1862 alone. And oftentimes these men were so incredibly familiar with North Carolina waterways that they were able to offer strategic advantage to the Navy. So one of those such gentlemen is George Commodore, who was a sailor during the Civil War, who I've pictured here. But we also have Captain Dempsey Hill. And Mr. Hill, we know his story because he was interviewed in 1891, years after the war, by the Boston Globe's first Black reporter, Robert T. Timo, at his home. And that's how we were able to get his experience documented. Captain Hill was born enslaved in Beaufort, and he worked on the water. Over the course of several months in 1861, Union forces, we see them capturing various parts of the coast, and he's hearing this, and he begins to put a plan in motion to liberate himself. So he goes ahead and he steals nautical charts from the local customs office, and then he buries them in the cemetery with a plan to recover them later. And then he flees in the November of 1861. This is prior to Beaufort falling to Union forces. There's a specific quote from the historian David Soselsky where he talks about Mr. Hill's experience. On a black pitch night, Hill and 4 other enslaved watermen returned to the cemetery and retrieved the charts. They then made their way to the waterfront a block south, being careful to avoid rebel patrols. They stayed low and moved quickly down a wharf, commandeered a pilot boat, and set sail. They sailed under the guns of Fort Macon and out the inlet into the open sea. As the moon came up, they could see the masts of Union naval vessels, part of the North Atlantic blockading squadron. The 5 black men steered towards the closest Union ship. As they approached, the ship's guns rolled out, and a voice called out and demanded to know who they were, friend or foe. Dempsey Hill and his companions shouted over the dark waves, "We are 5 Africans seeking freedom." When they climbed aboard the USS Brasileira, they were slaves no more. In his interview with the Boston Globe, Captain Hill also noted that we told the captain that we were all watermen and wanted to become sailors and free men. That was able to happen, obviously, and he was able to serve in the Navy aboard various vessels. After the close of the Civil War, he went north, eventually settling in Massachusetts, and he continued to make his living on the water. So another such story is that of William B. Gould, and he was an enslaved plasterer in Wilmington at Bellamy Mansion. For those of you who have visited Wilmington, Bellamy Mansion is currently stewarded by Preservation North Carolina, and they have really incredible plaster work there. And he obviously was a very skilled individual who was able to create that piece. So I think it's important to see there are all different types of skill sets of people who are seeking to free themselves. In September of 1862, Gould, along with several other men, procured a small boat and entered it at the edge of Orange Street in Wilmington, what we call today Orange Landing, as we have pictured here. These men took their freedom via the Cape Fear River, sailing nearly 30 nautical miles down the river before reaching the Atlantic, where they were intercepted by the USS Cambridge. In a matter of days, Gould took an oath to join the Navy, where he served for the remainder of the war. He documented his experiences in a journal, and I think that this is a particularly interesting story because I think it's one of those ways that our landscape, our communities, hold these stories. So, you know, on the boardwalk, downtown Wilmington, a lot of people vacation, tourists, all kinds of folks make their way through there. And, you know, this is a site of freedom seeking. This is somebody's experience, somebody's ancestor whose story that we are able to continue to share. All right, so in my final example connected to naval ships, in this example, I want to reinforce that there are people of different ages that are also seeking their freedom. It's not just adult men that we are seeing, and again, that people are not just waiting for announcement, and they didn't require direction to figure out how to free themselves. And it's also complex. So, and because of that, some people had really pretty terrifying experiences of how it went for them. So this is a story of Alex Huggins, whose story we know from a 1936 WPA narrative. And Mr. Huggins, who was then of Wilmington, describes his experience liberating himself from New Bern in 1863. And then at that time, he was just 12 years old. And he was very aware of the war, and in his interview, he tells the interviewer that he wanted to give freedom a try, and he thought he had to just get away from home to have it. So he was able to convince a couple of his peers and an adult male to join him. They were able to get a boat, and then they went out to sea. And Mr. Huggins talks about this adventure quickly turning to fear, that he was so afraid that he got sick as they headed further out to sea, and that they were later picked up by the mail steamer, the North Star, that we have pictured here, where they remained along with its journey. At the time, the North Star was being escorted by the USS Nereus, and he would later join the Navy in 1864 and the crew of the Nereus, serving as a cabin boy with the special responsibility of waiting on the captain, and he would have been about 13 years old at that point. He was on board this ship during the bombardment of Fort Fisher here in North Carolina, and during that event, he would witness two of his comrades that he served with perish. And he recounts this and other experiences in his narrative and describes being discharged at the Brooklyn Navy Yard after 18 months of service. He would continue to live in New York for 5 years, and then return to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he made a living in the crude drug business. He was able to marry, have a son, support his mother, and help support his nephew as well. He would receive a $75 a month pension, $10 of which went to his nephew. So another instance beyond the Navy, folks may be very familiar with United States Colored Troops. You'll probably hear me say USCT. And on June 19th, 1863, the first company of USCT raised in North Carolina, and quite possibly the nation, was organized as the African Brigade. The 1st Regiment of North Carolina Colored Volunteers was based in New Bern, North Carolina, and they would be supported by New Bern's Colored Women's Union for the benefit of the Colored Brigade. They paid for their battle flag, and they inscribed it with the word liberty. 6,000 men from North Carolina would serve in these units during the Civil War, and in this capacity they were liberators, truly fighting for freedom for themselves and for others. The African Brigade would later become the 35th, 36th, 37th Regiments, and the 14th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. There were a number of USCT regiments that saw battle in North Carolina, and some were also responsible for building infrastructure that allowed the Union Army to advance through the state at the war's end. Their engagements in North Carolina would be across the state, so Fort Fisher, Wilmington, Kinston, Goldsboro, Raleigh, and Durham. There were also several units that would have borne witness to the April 1865 surrender of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnson to Union General William T. Sherman at the last surrender of a major Confederate army during the Civil War, which would take place in Durham. And I love this image. It's depicting a reunion of the 35th U.S. Colored Troops in Plymouth in 1905, showing that their story lives on. So another gentleman that we have several depicted here. There are names that we know if you're familiar with history, people like Abraham Galloway, a formerly enslaved Southport native who took his freedom in 1857, would go on to be an abolitionist, an activist, and a Union spy. We have William Henry Singleton, who was a formerly enslaved New Bern native, who took his freedom multiple times. And then there is Fernie Bryant, who recruited black men to serve in the regiment, as well as trained these men and advocated for their rights as soldiers. And while it is an opportunity for them to have freedom, while it is an opportunity for them to serve, not dissimilar from the Navy, it was not an easy path for these individuals. Racism, discrimination was a challenge. White officers, though they might be on the Union side, didn't necessarily consider them to be equals, that they were smart enough or able to take on certain tasks or maneuvers. There's also a significant risk that these men are facing in fighting the Confederacy, because if they're going to be captured, they're going to be returned to enslavement, which certainly would not be what they are hoping for. I will say with particularly USCT history, if that's something you're interested in learning about, there is a fantastic group based out of Tryon Palace. They're literally called the 35th, and it's a reenactment group, and each of them depicts individuals who would have served during this time period, and they do a really fantastic job with it. Parts of eastern North Carolina, as we've talked about, they're being taken by Union troops over the course of several months, and this begins in 1861. Yeah. By the summer of 1862, Union forces controlled most of North Carolina's coast, and so that includes several cities. We're seeing Washington, New Bern, Elizabeth City, and Plymouth. And in response, enslaved people are starting to travel to these territories and then to freedom. In this ad that we see from July of 1862 from Wilmington, we learn about two more men who are running towards liberation. It's a gentleman named Dick, who is in his late 30s and has attempted to take his freedom before. And the ad describes him as he was in New Bern jail in the year 1853, having obtained forged free papers from Bladen County. He passed himself off under his free papers at the time as Richard Freeman. In this instance, we're seeing Dick has likely forged free papers again, and that he's running towards his wife and children in New Bern, where they too have escaped to the enemy. Dick is traveling with a young man, a 21-year-old named Halton. And I like this example because it's reinforcing the reasoning for folks obtaining freedom. Many of those reasons are obvious, but this is a story of a man who's trying to get back to his wife and kids because enslavement has separated them over time. And that, again, this is men, this is women, this is children of all ages who are fighting and seeking and identifying ways to seek their freedom. And it's during this time period that we also see what we call freedmen's colonies crop up in eastern North Carolina, and I do have several of those as examples here. So the first being Hotel de Afrique, and this begins its foundations in 1861 after Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark were taken by Union forces following the Battle of Hatteras Inlet. Again, word is spreading. Enslaved people begin moving and making their way to claim their liberation. At the time, Union troops were able to transform a Confederate-built building near the fort into a barracks for these arrivals, and the barracks would become known as Hotel de Afrique. Here, newly liberated people would receive housing and food in exchange for building fortifications, loading ships, assisting in navigating waterways, and it's really considered the first safe haven for Black people during this time period claiming their liberation. But again, conditions are not ideal. Hard labor, and oftentimes people are not being compensated for their labor. There's also violence amongst refugees. We do have documentation that at one point a Black man was murdered by a white Union soldier after an attack in the barracks. And I share that example as an instance, again, of talking about who we are framing as liberators, that again, Union soldiers, Union allies didn't necessarily see the equality of Black people at this time, though that is obviously part of the war. And this is not in the first instance in this particular colony where Black people are being harassed or murdered in this case. As the war continues, again, more freedmen's colonies. As it moves northwards on the Outer Banks, in February 1862, the Battle of Roanoke Island ended with the control of the island. And at the time, there were already 200 enslaved people who had been forced to work at a Confederate camp located on the island. And as others start to move their way elsewhere, the population continues to grow. In these early days, the camp is referred to as a contraband camp. That's the term used to designate enslaved people who would make their way to Union lines. In the spring of 1863, this camp becomes a colony, formerly Roanoke Island Freedmen Colony, and it eventually is organized into avenues, cross streets, plots. They're able to build homes, schools, churches, hospitals, stores, and all kinds of other businesses. And by 1864, there are 2,212 liberated Black people living on the colony, and by 1865, it's grown to nearly 4,000. So it's certainly a significant location. And I do have a map included here, just kind of depicting for folks where these are located. Hotel de Afrique being located further south, and Roanoke Island being closer to now present-day Manio in that area. In March of 1862, Union troops broke through Confederate lines defending New Bern, completing control of the city. Similar to what we saw with Hatteras and Roanoke Island, word is spreading, people are making their way, and in this location, it's large numbers. The 30 acres was confiscated and used to establish a settlement, which would originally be known as Trent River Camp or Trent River Settlement. And freedmen were immediately put to work building fortifications in New Bern. Some of them were paid $8 a month and provided a meal a day for their labor, but many also worked to load and unload supply ships on the Neuse River and build a railroad bridge across the Trent River to replace one that had previously been destroyed during the war. Later, the Trent River settlement would be renamed James City in honor of its founder, Horace James, who was the superintendent of Negro Affairs and agent for the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. James City went on to be one of the largest freedmen settlements in the state, and by 1865, nearly 3,000 people lived in the camp. Freed people began to establish hospitals, schools, churches, and banks, including the first African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in the state and South, St. Peter AME Zion Church, which would be founded by Bishop James Wecker Hood. So I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau. As this era of the war is taking place, this bureau has agents and officials that are being sent by the federal government, appointed to various they kind of section off the state into various territories to assist in reinforcing liberation. There's a lot of complex stories that are happening with that. Obviously, there's not enough folks to really facilitate this in the best way possible, as there are people who are not interested in emancipation and freedom happening for people. So I also want to call this to reference the fact that, again, liberation is not instant, and there is resistance. So we do have an example of a set of correspondence between a Plymouth woman and her husband between 1864 and 65. And during this correspondence, this is when Union troops held the city. And the husband urges his wife to try to get them to stay with you if you can. And she responds to say that she gave two people she enslaved, Solomon and Jane, $12 per person in Confederate money to stay. She also states, I don't think they will go to the Yankees, not yet, but the Yankees have come, they feel freer. And so she's literally bribing people to remain enslaved. Her husband continues to urge her to do what she can to prevent Solomon and Jane from taking their freedom, writing, if they are ever free, I will do as much for them that stays home as the Yankees will do for them that leaves home. Keep them home if you can. Okay. Towards the end of the war, talking more about the Freedmen's Bureau and dividing up the counties into different zones, we also have examples of formerly enslaved people assisting others to claim their liberation, mostly family members. And so there are several examples of this that I'll share briefly. In one instance, we have a freedman named David Anderson, whose mother Grace was enslaved by the Barnhill family in Bladen County. Grace wants to leave, and her enslaver Barnhill has refused to allow her to. Mr. Anderson approaches Barnhill to retrieve his mother numerous times and is threatened to be shot. He is able to return with a letter from the Freedmen's Bureau stating that they must allow him to take her with him. We have another instance in Columbus County about a woman named Fanny Brown who wishes to live with her mother. The man who enslaved her, William Baldwin, again, refuses to let her leave, and her brother, Mitchell Morrison, is attempting to retrieve her. And we have this letter documented from the Freedmen's Bureau in hand to assist with that project. These are examples, and there are numerous, that are happening after the fall of 1865, after the Civil War's end, that people are continuing to be enslaved, and again, after Juneteenth. Again, freedom is not instant and is complicated by the realities of the war, and oftentimes we're seeing Black people having to take charge in claiming it for themselves. As we learned during our time together, the Union advances through and across North Carolina. We see the Emancipation Proclamation enforced. It's taking time. It's not clean. It's not simple. We're seeing these documented instances of resistance. We're also seeing, again, more instances of people who should have been emancipated earlier. There is an instance in Iredell County where several sales of Black people were recorded in 1865. Later on, we see that again in 1867. And then in Stanley County, we see it as late as 1866. And Person County as late as 1869, where we see a transaction involving a Black man named Bob who was still recorded as being enslaved. This is why I want to challenge you to think beyond just one single date or event, to think more broadly about liberation and freedom, because particularly in North Carolina, we're seeing our timeline is all over the place, and it's not just happening in one instance. And again, there are people like Bob in Person County who are remaining bound, not simply out of defiance of whites, but of something much deeper going on here. And these are all instances of data that comes from the People Not Property project being led by the UNCG libraries. Projects like this collecting freedom-seeking ads and databases, historic newspapers, help us continue to learn more about what liberation looked like in North Carolina. I don't think this is something where we're ever going to have a finite answer, but it's something that as we continue to learn these stories, we can make them more complete and have a fuller sense of the narrative. This is also why I want to encourage you to celebrate our state's liberation stories, like the story of the gentleman on this slide, William Headley. This is a picture of Mr. Headley shortly after he arrived in New Bern in 1864. His journey to freedom is documented on the back of this very image, and he was contraband from a plantation near Raleigh, North Carolina, and arrived in New Bern on the 20th of May, 1864, having been 6 weeks on the road, neither sleeping or eating in a house during the time. 2 others left with him, but were caught by the slaveholders' bloodhounds and either killed or taken back. He was weak and nearly famished when he arrived. His clothes were of many colors and qualities. His cloak consisted of an old cotton grain bag slit open on one side and raveled, which gives the appearance of fringe. He appeared perfectly happy and satisfied upon reaching the Union lines and is now one of the best hands working on Fort Chase, North Carolina, June 11th, 1864, near New Bern. This is a gentleman who liberated himself. And again, over a year after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and he's still being held in bondage in Raleigh. And so he left, and he ran for 6 weeks to freedom in New Bern and made it. So as promised, I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking about emancipation celebrations and really sharing to you that North Carolina has a long history of celebrating that. And it's people that we're seeing in several cities we've talked about, Beaufort, Elizabeth City, New Bern, Plymouth, are having documented emancipation celebrations as early as January 1864. And this helps us to understand that people in those areas received news of liberation and began to reestablish their lives as freed people as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. We have this small article that appeared in New Bern newspaper, North Carolina Times, on January 16th, 1864. The colored persons of Beaufort and vicinity celebrate the anniversary of the President's proclamation in a very appropriate and successful manner. A very fine and patriotic address, well considered and well delivered, was made by Abraham Galloway. A beautiful table was spread on Queen Street, and the beginning of the new year witnessed a happy gathering of colored persons with full bellies and shining faces. The evening closed with New Year's gatherings and its usual festivities. A portion of this article from the very same newspaper on the same date reads, "The colored people of Plymouth held their first anniversary of their freedom in the Methodist Church on New Year's Day. Speeches were made, songs were sung, and a happy time was realized. It was truly a feast of the soul to the people whose shackles have been loosened and bid to go free. They will always remember the new year, for it will be the beginning of a new life to them." I think that this is exciting to share, and I think particularly as we talk about the history of celebrating, you know, for some folks, Juneteenth is a newer holiday. It's a newer concept, being our newest federal holiday, but Black North Carolinians have been celebrating this for years, well before Juneteenth. So these are just some of the ways that liberation took shape in North Carolina, and it continues to flex, to flow, evolve, and grow. And North Carolina would then also become the second to the last state to approve the 13th Amendment on December 4th, 1865. Why the delay? State legislators feared that the amendment would give Congress the power to regulate civil rights for blacks. This amendment, of course, would officially prohibit slavery in the United States, effective December 15th, 1865, though, of course, we have examples of folks who were enslaved beyond then. But as this time is evolving, we see people going on to create liberation spaces, communities like Princeville, North Carolina, churches, schools, institutions like Shaw University, newspapers like the Star of Zion and the Charlotte Post. We see them become lawmakers, business owners, artisans, educators, and activists. And ultimately, we're seeing people work together to create new lives in their own oasis spaces. I hope that you have a better understanding of why we celebrate emancipation, especially annually on June 19th, Juneteenth. The holiday exists to celebrate the promise, realization, and spirit of freedom. Communities in North Carolina have celebrated Juneteenth for decades, but especially in the mid-1990s, we see many festivals becoming more common in our area. Some of our earliest Juneteenth festivals were established in Rocky Mount, Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Greensboro. Juneteenth Festival of the Carolinas in Charlotte and the Juneteenth Festival in Winston-Salem, that's now run by Triad Cultural Arts, are some of the longest tenures. We also have colleagues at Stagville State Historic Site who have a really lengthy tradition of honoring and celebrating Juneteenth, including through events. And I think we've certainly seen in recent years that more cities, more municipalities and places are taken this opportunity to celebrate. So I hope that this challenged you to think about Juneteenth a little bit more broadly and to understand what liberation, freedom, and emancipation has meant in our state. If you are looking for resources, I would love to direct you to our website. We have what we call our Juneteenth Toolkit, which has more resources, more stories, but also we have a community calendar sharing events across the state. Juneteenth's coming up this week. So if you are looking for places to celebrate with your family, if you're looking for historic sites and places where you can dive more deeply into these stories, I do invite you to take a look. Our team has worked incredibly hard to pull this together as a resource. And I'll stay on the slide since I see folks taking advantage of the QR code. All right. And then also, as promised, last but not least, I do want to take just a quick moment to talk about North Carolina Freedom Park, which I mentioned at the top. Again, only park in North Carolina dedicated to the African American fight for freedom. We have quotes from individuals like Abraham Galloway, who are situated as voices of freedom, talking about freedom from the very earliest days on up through present times in North Carolina. It was designated as a space to invite school children to Raleigh, but also very much to be a reflective space for folks. So if you find yourself in downtown, it's located off of Wilmington Street, right across the street from the legislature, and it's certainly an excellent resource that I want more folks to take advantage of, and we'd love to see you there. And with that brings us towards the end of our time together. So thank you so much for listening. I know it's getting to be a late evening for folks.